Word in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Psalm 34, and after speaking of some of the lessons that he learned, he then says to these individuals in the cave of Adullam, who were listening intently to him, he says in verse 11, "Come, ye children, hearken unto me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." One of the issues that is part and parcel of life is simply making mistakes. The best and the rest of us, we all make mistakes. Take, for example, Henry Ford. Of course, he's known for being the man to build the first car or automobile, but what you may not know is that Henry Ford, he forgot to put a reverse gear in the first car that he ever manufactured. Thomas Edison, of course, was probably America's greatest ever inventor, credited with creating the first record player as well as the first long-lasting light bulb. He has over 1,000 patents to his name. In other words, he's credited with inventing at least 1,000 things. And yet in the late 1800s, he was said to invest $2 million, now that's an awful lot of money back then, $2 million on something that really proved to be of little or no value at that time. We all make mistakes. David was a man after God's own heart, and yet the one thing I love about the Spirit of God is the honesty of God concerning David, because whilst he was a man after God's own heart, yet many of his mistakes are written down for us to learn from in the Bible. And this is essentially where we are in Psalm 34. There was that period in David's life where he went on the run from King Saul, not because he had to, or not because he wanted to, but because he had to. You remember time and time again, David, he was really made a target for, in quite a literal sense, by King Saul. On various occasions, Saul took his javelin and tried to kill the sweet psalmist of Israel as he was playing for him. And yet, on the run from Saul, rather than staying close to the Lord, David, it seems, he got far away from the Lord. And somewhere as he's on the run from Saul, he begins to take his eye off the Lord. And in 1 Samuel 21, we see him fleeing to a place called Nob. Now, in the outset, that seems to be a good place to flee to, because Nob really was where the tabernacle was pitched in 1 Samuel 21. And you see him coming to the priest, coming to Ahimelech, and speaking with them and taking Goliath's sword there in the opening 9 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 21. And he gives all of the impression that he's about to use this sword to go back into battle, to fight against Saul's armies that are literally hounding him down. He gives all of the impression that he's ready to fight. But the reality is that the wheels are beginning to come off for him. And just 4 verses later, we find in 1 Samuel 21 and verse 13, he is now fled out of the coasts of Israel, far away from Israel, and he has fled to Philistia. Now, what was and where was Philistia? Well, it was the land of the Philistines. And he has fled to Gath. Now, that is mind-boggling, because even the boys and girls here this morning, you'll know that there was a giant that David defeated, and he was from Gath, Goliath. And where does David flee to as he is on the run from Saul's army? He flees to Gath. And yet, whilst he was at Gath, he thinks, well, I can hide here from Saul's army. They'll not find me here. And in a sense, you can't blame him for thinking like that. But what he forgets is that he was well known in Gath. As soon as David walks through the town, as it were, people, they immediately begin to twig, as we would say. There's David. Saul has slain his thousands, but David has 10,000s. There's the young man who, just a few chapters previously, has slain our seemingly undefeatable giant. And David's worried here. But as I've said, he's also far away from the Lord. And in 1 Samuel 21, just listen to this. The sweet psalmist of Israel, the person who wrote Psalm 23 and many other psalms, we read that he changed his behavior before them, feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down from his beard. See what David's at here? He pretends to be a madman. He pretends to literally present himself as crazy, delusional. And his hope really is this: as they see me thinking, and they think that I'm mad, they'll just kind of leave me alone, or they'll send me away. And yet, it was here, after he feigns himself to be mad, and the spittle, you just see him there, what a sight, the spittle literally falling down his beard, and he's scratching on the door, really just like a madman. In the midst of this difficulty, in the midst of this time where he takes his eye off the Lord, it seems almost as if God takes a dealing with him. And he comes to himself. And we find him then eventually going to the cave of Adullam in 1 Samuel chapter 22. And as he has come back to the Lord, and as he has this group of followers who have come out to meet him, there's about 500-600 of them. They've resolved, I'm not following King Saul. They find out where David is. They follow him. And they essentially say, David, you're going to be the one that we're going to follow. And so he gathers them around. And as I've said in verse 11, he says this well-known verse. And very often we quote it to children, or we try and teach them to the children. But really, the thought is here that he's gathering this group of Israelites together, and he's saying, look, listen and learn from the lesson, learn from the mistakes that I have made. Come, children of the Lord, listen to me, and I will teach you the fear of God. Come and learn from my many mistakes. Come and learn with me the lessons that I have learned, as I've taken my eye off the Lord. But he has never taken his eye off me. You see, this morning, if you never make a mistake, if you think you never make a mistake, then you are mistaken. We all make mistakes. We all fall. If the man after God's own heart fell, and fell numerous times, then there will be times where we will fall into sin. There's none of us who can lift up ourselves this morning, elevate ourselves to be higher than David. Not one of you can say this morning, I have never made a mistake. And you're lying if you do. You're bearing false witness. The important thing this morning is not making mistakes, but it's how you come back from them and what you learn. What you learn from making those mistakes. And I believe that's why David, with all of my heart, under the inspiration of God, takes time to count his blessings here in Psalm 34, to enumerate them, to jot them down, and gather this group around and say, come, listen to me. Learn from my mistakes. So let's learn this morning from the man of God's mistakes. Lessons learned from David's mistakes. Think with me firstly here about his resolution. His resolution. Look at verse 1. Very simply, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. So in 1 Samuel 22, after feigning himself to be mad in Gath for fear of his life, for fear of the Philistines coming and killing him, he ends up in the cave of Adullam. He ends up back in the territory of Israel. It was in the southwest, really, of Jerusalem, in the south of Israel. And that is really an indication even itself of the fact that God has worked a work of restoration in David's heart. He wants to get back in home territory. He wants to get back to the people of God. He wants to get back to the children of Israel. And that is really just a simple evidence, I believe, of him having already been restored, as he's in this cave of Adullam. And as he was in this cave, well, the sweet psalmist of Israel, what does he do? It seems he gets his harp out and he does what he knows best. He praises the Lord. He praises the Lord. Now, when you think about this, circumstances were not exactly for him. He's on the run from King David. He has lost his best friend, Jonathan. He has had to separate from Saul's son, Jonathan. He's lost contact with him now. More importantly, he has failed the Lord. He's far away from the Lord. And he's now in this dark and gloomy cave. And if you read 1 Samuel 22, you'll find that they weren't exactly the most encouraging a band of people. There were those who were in debt. There were those who were in distress. There were those who were discouraged. They're essentially a bunch of Job's comforters to David. They're not going to be much encouragement to him. And yet in midst of all of this discouragement, what does he do in this cave? He praises the Lord. Verse 1, I will bless the Lord at all times. At all times. Now that's remarkable. See, he was nowhere near the throne at this time. He's in a cave. He's far away from his companions. Things really just don't look too good for him, too promising for him. And what he's showing you very simply is this, is that his external circumstances didn't seem to move him internally as he has now come back to the Lord. Whether he was in safety or in danger, whether he was in adversity or in prosperity, David has learned to make the Lord, rather than circumstances, the object of his praise. Now, things haven't really changed in terms of his circumstances. If anything, they got slightly worse. He's in this cave. Yes, he's back in home territory, but Saul still wants to kill him at this stage. What has changed is David here, is his perspective. And this is why he can say, I will bless the Lord at all times. Yes, his circumstances haven't really changed externally, but internally he has a different view on his circumstances. And child of God, this morning you are to praise the Lord in the good as well as the bad. Like the psalmist David, his praise, the praise of God, should continually be in your mouth. You will find this, child of God, when you have a general spirit of just humble submission and humble trust in the Lord, you will be less moved by circumstances. You will be less moved by them. Think of Paul when he spoke of all of the external difficulties that he faced, and yet he said in Corinthians, none of these things move me. He was saying, externally, things may change, but internally I haven't changed, and therefore my perspective is the same. I will bless the Lord at all times. When you focus on the goodness of God and the mercy of God and the compassion of God to your soul, then like the psalmist, you should be able to say that his praise will continue to be in your mouth. He continues on in verses 2 and 3 in this note of praise, doesn't he? My soul shall make her boast in the Lord, verse 2. Verse 3, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. And so here is David. He has this holy resolve now. Now that he is restored to the Lord, he takes time to this group of discouraged, this group of downcast disciples, and he tells them very simply, look, get your eye off all that's going on around you. Get your eye on the goodness of God, because he's been good to me. So he'll be good to you. The Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, was known for being very cruel and austere. Hard man to work with, as we would say. Now, he was a brilliant leader, but he was extremely demanding. And in old age, someone asked him, have you any regrets about how you conducted yourself as Duke? And he said, the one thing I would do more of is this. I would give more praise. I'd give more praise. Now, he was thinking, obviously, about praising others and praising individuals for their work, etc. But surely, I think that come the end of life, if you ask any Christian what their regret would be, they would certainly say that in the spiritual. I'd give more praise. I will bless the Lord at all times. His resolution. I want you to think then, secondly, with me about his remembrance. His remembrance. He begins to remember now in verse 4 of Psalm 34. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, delivered me from all my fears. Verse 6, this poor man cried, and the Lord heard him, and saved him out of all his troubles. So David's now in the cave of Adullam. He's back in home territory. And as he is there, obviously his mind is taken back to essentially what he's just come from and what has just happened. How he was in Gath, how he feigned himself to be mad. Why? Because he was afraid. We didn't read 1 Samuel 21 for sake of time, but you will find this if you read that. You will find that he was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And I mean, you can't blame David. He's in amongst the Philistines. He's a marked man. He is the person who has slain the giant Goliath, who was from Gath. He's right in the midst of his home territory. And now he's spotted. And so you really can't blame David for being all that afraid. But the mind-boggling thing about it is this, is that David has experienced far greater threat in his earlier days. You remember, by this time, in 1 Samuel 21, he has slain the giant Goliath, hasn't he? But more than that, he's slain a bear. And he slain a lion. Whenever he presented himself in 1 Samuel 17 to King Saul and said, look, I'll fight Goliath. Well, Saul asked him the question, look, where's your experience in battle? And he makes it very, very clear that when I was out in the fields, I slew a bear and I slew a lion. And yet here he is, in this territory of Gath, and he was sore afraid. He was afraid. He feared for his life. And it seems, I believe, at that moment, it's only my hunch, but at that moment, as he was afraid, as he feared for his life, he does what any decent saint of God does, and he lifts up his heart to the Lord. And that is why he's writing verse 4. I sought the Lord and he heard me, delivered me from my fears. Verse 6, he recognizes that he's poor. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved or delivered him from all of his troubles. It seems that in Achish, David was restored. He said, Lord, deliver me. Verse 5, he looked to the Lord. Their faces were not ashamed. Verse 6, he cried. And so now he is remembering the goodness of God when he delivered him from this very difficult trial, this predicament that he was in. And more importantly, whenever he was backslidden as well and far away from God. And child of God, this morning, as well as rendering the Lord praise, you are to remember his goodness. Remember his interventions for you in your life. You know, we're all guilty of doing what David did here, aren't we? And I'm sure there are times where maybe you didn't get far, far, far away from God. You maybe weren't in the far country like the prodigal. But every single day, our hearts have the propensity to drift from Jesus Christ. And sometimes what does it take? It takes the Lord to bring a trial, to bring a distress, to bring a difficulty into our lives, where we then take up the posture again of David and we say, Lord, deliver me from this trial, deliver me from this fix, from this hardship. And child of God, where that has happened, learn from it and ensure that it doesn't happen again. Because when you feel the heart drifting from Christ, you know what you'll find? You'll find that the Lord will just bring something, sometimes not even something huge. It doesn't have to be necessarily a death or a huge trial, but just something. Just something. Something in work, something at home. Something just isn't quite right. And you've seen that and you've felt that. And so we learn from our mistakes. We jot them down even. I think it's good to keep a journal, to jot it down, that there was a time when I cried to the Lord and he was good to me. So that might even be used as a means of guarding your heart, of garrisoning your heart, and keeping you in the way. You think of Hannah in Scripture. She came to the Lord in Samuel. She was seeking a son, in 1 Samuel that is, and she cried that a miracle would be wrought. And in 1 Samuel 1:18 we read that the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. So she came and she prayed. And we read that her countenance was no more sad. Why was it that she was no longer sad? Because she was convinced that God was going to intervene. That's why. Psalm 102 verse 17, he will regard the prayer of the destitute, not despise their prayer. Feel yourself to be destitute, a time of difficulty, a time where the way is hedged up. And you pray, you'll not turn away that prayer. Maybe there's someone here this morning and you've just got far away from the Lord and the Lord is beginning to bring things into your life. That's his way of saying, look, hearken to me and I'll teach you the fear of the Lord. Listen to what I'm doing. His resolution, his remembrance. I want you to see thirdly here his recognition. In verses 7 and 8 we read, the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. Verse 8, O taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. It's easy to forget that David could have easily been killed in Gath. Easily. He was afraid for rightful and proper reasons. I mean, there he is. He's in enemy territories. He's hiding from the king of Israel. He believes he's not going to get found out. And in a sense, he's right, because King Saul just leaves him there. And yet, as he is amongst these individuals, these foreigners, these pagans, these Gentiles, these individuals who really notice him and just do not like him. It seems that whilst he was far away from the Lord was not far from him. And in verse 7, he recounts that the angel of God just encamped round about him. Now, the term angel here is messenger. Messenger of the Lord. And I want to suggest to you today that whenever you often read of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, for example, in Exodus chapter 3, where the angel was there, and as Moses turned aside and he saw the great sight, various other individuals, Jacob at Padan Aram, where the angel of the Lord was there, often when you read of the angel of the Lord, you're reading of a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. And I believe this is what happened with David. It wasn't just a heavenly angel. It wasn't the like of Michael the archangel or Gabriel or some of these other angels. I believe with all of my heart that this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, and he comes to meet David at his time of need, and he protects him. David could have easily lost his life here. I mean, can you imagine him? He's in the middle of enemy territory. He has slain the one that they have pinned their hopes on. He may as well walk about with a target on his back. And yet he recognizes that Christ came to his aid. Christ came to his rescue, and he encamped round about them that fear him. It's as if Jesus has just encamped round about him, put a holy hedge of fire round about him. And David recognizes this. And so again, he gathers this people round. He jots it down for you and I to learn from today, from them to learn from. And he says, look, come, listen to me. Because I remember a time when I did not deserve the intervention of Christ. But he came and he encamped round about me. When I was far away from God, when I was backslidden, as I just lifted my poor feeble heart to him, he encamped round about me. And then that's why he says in verse 8, taste and see that the Lord's good. Blessed is the man that trusts in him. And even the faraway child of God is never a forgotten child of God. You're never forgotten. Maybe there's a time in your life and you can remember, and it does happen to us, predominantly when we're younger, and we want to get out and try the things of the world, or the heart just gravitates towards the things of this world. There is pleasure in sin. It is for a season, but there is pleasure there. Moses says that. And yet what happens, even when we're far away from God and we're out in a far country, Christ, because we are a child of his, he encamps round about us. Now let me just say, that is not a license to do what you want. That is not a license to sin. But it is a comfort that when you're far away from Christ, he's never far away from you. How many times do you hear people testify of a time when they should have passed away, when they were far away from God, a near miss in a car accident, something happens at work, and what happens? The angel of the Lord just encamps round about them. And child of God, you find this. A time when you should have been cast off, when you should have been cast away, and you were far away from God. Maybe even this past week, this past month, this past year, you're not where you should be with God, and there's been a near miss, there's been something, there's been a health complaint, whatever it might be. And yet you have felt this today. The angel of the Lord, Christ himself, has just hedged up your way. You know, Archibald Brown was the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle after Spurgeon. And on one occasion he was preaching in the Isle of Wight. The wind was blowing all day, the sea was rapidly rising, the tide was coming in, and they were staying where they're staying, a little kind of a beach house just on the shore really. And they could see the tide coming in and rapidly rising and the winds howling. And the wife was petrified. And Archibald Brown got out his watch, looked at the time, and he said, "Dear, I think it's time we'll go to bed." And he went to bed. His wife, bemused, "What, with the waves so near?" "Yes." And he recognized that the tide had just reached its peak. And it was about to go back. It would come no further. And what he had faith in was the God-given natural law of the tide. He had ultimate faith, obviously, in the God of order, the one who would keep his promises. His ultimate faith was in the Lord. But obviously it was in his intervention in natural things as well. He recognized that the angel of the Lord encamps round about them that fear him. His resolution, his remembrance, his recognition. We're just skimming the surface here of this psalm, and then I want you to see lastly here his remonstration. He remonstrates here with this group in the cave of Adullam in 1 Samuel 22. Look at verse 11. Come ye children, hearken to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. So he's taken time to recognize the goodness of God, the intervention of God, the protection of God, the provision of God, even though he was far away. And so he gathers them together as his children, in terms of his spiritual children, those who follow the Lord. And he tells them to hearken, listen. And he's going to teach them something. Now, what does he teach them then? And this is just where we're bringing this all to a conclusion here. Look at verse 13. He teaches them concerning their words. Keep thy tongue from evil, thy lips from speaking guile. Oh, David could look back to his time in Gath, and he could certainly say that he had disgraced himself. He was the Lord's anointed, in the sense that he was chosen to be the next king. With great position comes great responsibility. And yet he had uttered such foolish things. When you take time to read 1 Samuel 22, you will actually find that he enlisted himself in the Philistine army for a little while. Imagine that. To try and hide himself, he enlisted himself and he submitted himself to the king of Gath, King Achish. And he was so foolish. And he recognizes that. He recognizes that he was foolish with his words. He lied, he was deceptive. And he then takes these people, these individuals, and he says this to them: learn from my mistake. Keep your lips from being deceptive. Keep your lips from speaking guile, verse 13. Keep your tongue from evil. This is what I have learned. I have learned that I was foolish as I got far away from God with my mouth. Hearken. Their words and then their walk, verse 14. Depart from evil, do good, seek peace and pursue it. David was so foolish with his walk as well, wasn't he? You know, I often wonder, was this held against him whenever he became king? I often wonder that. Oh, sure, there's the young lad who wandered off to Philistia, to enemy territory, enlisted himself in the very enemy's army. Oh, he was so foolish, wasn't he? I mean, you just think about it. A future king, and he's literally scratching indoors and dribbling down his beard, feeling himself to be mad. 1 Samuel 21, verse 13. How foolish he was with his walk when he was far away from the Lord. And so he gathers these individuals together and he says, look, I have been foolish with my words when I was far away from God. I was foolish with my walk. Hearken to me, listen, and I'm going to teach you now. I'm going to teach you. Learn from my mistakes. And again, child of God, I'm sure you've been there. We've all been there. We've been far away from the Lord. You've been far away from the Lord. You've said foolish things, or you've even did foolish things. Why is it that sometimes you hear of a terrible fall, or you hear of a Christian, maybe an individual, and you maybe set them up on a pinnacle, whatever it might be? It's because we're far away from God. Maybe of a great fall, to say something, whatever it might be. And you know, as well as leaving the past, we need to learn from the past. We do need to learn. Yes, we learn from past successes to repeat those successes, but you learn from your past failures. Learn from your mistakes, child of God, so that you don't make those mistakes again. And you're being shown very simply here today that whenever you're far away from God, there is no telling the depths that you will fall. If David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the man after God's own heart, could do what he has done, and you know of other falls in his life when he was far away from the Lord as well, then you take your eye off Christ for just a day, a week, a month. There's no telling the depths that you could potentially fall to. There's no telling what you perhaps might say. I mean, look at Peter. He swore. Denied the Lord with what? With oaths and with cursings. Oh, how he got far away from God. And my David could say to him, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile. He could say to Peter, depart from evil, do good, seek peace, pursue it. Peter learned from that mistake. And you know the blessed thing about Peter, when you look at his life, it seems that he learned his lesson. With the best will in the world, it seems that he learned his lesson. Oh, child of God, learn. Learn from the mistakes of this great saint of God in the past. Churchill said, and with this I'm finished, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If you don't learn from your past mistakes, you're going to repeat them. And that's foolish. We could go on here, but I trust that you've got the gist of what we're trying to say today. Lessons learned from David's mistakes. May the Lord help us to learn